In the spring of 1841, in the low, humid heart of Georgia, there stood a plantation that never truly slept. By day, it appeared no different from the others that dotted the red-soil countryside. Wide white columns, sprawling cotton fields, and a house that gleamed with polish and order. But when night fell, the air around the estate grew unnaturally heavy, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The cicadas sang softer there, the wind moved slower, and sometimes, when the moon was thin and pale, a sound would rise from the ground itself, quickly, swallowed by the earth before anyone could swear they had heard it. The plantation belonged to Jonathan Whitmore, a man whose name carried weight across 3 counties. He was known as disciplined, God-fearing and proper. He hosted church gatherings on Sundays and spoke often of morality, duty, and family honor. His handshake was firm. His smile was practiced. To outsiders, Whitmore was the image of Southern respectability, a man who ruled his land efficiently and kept his household in perfect order. No debts, no scandals, no rumors that could stick. And yet, people noticed things. Wagons entered the plantation more often than expected, especially after sunset. Supplies were taken below the house rather than into the main storage sheds. Slaves assigned to the big house changed frequently, their names spoken once and then never again. When neighbors asked casual questions, "Where did that young man go? Why has the cellar door been reinforced?" Whitmore answered calmly, always with a reasonable explanation. Sold south, reassigned, repairs, discipline. In Georgia, in 1841, explanations like that were enough. The house itself was old, built decades earlier, with thick wooden floors and a foundation dug deep into clay. Beneath it lay a cellar larger than most, originally meant for storing food, tools, and valuables during unstable times. It was cool down there, even in the hottest summers. Dark. Sound traveled strangely in that space. Voices seemed to die before reaching the stairs. The cellar door was kept locked, not with a simple latch but with iron. Heavy, newly installed iron. Most people assumed it was for protection. Whitmore said as much himself, laughing lightly when asked. "You can never be too careful with thieves," he'd say, or with temptation. He never clarified what kind of temptation he meant. Inside the house lived his daughter, Eleanor Whitmore. She was 19 that year, pale-skinned and sharp-eyed, with hair the color of dried wheat and a way of watching people that made even confident men shift uncomfortably. She rarely attended social events anymore. When she did, she spoke little, smiling at odd moments, her attention drifting as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. Suitors came and went, approved by her father, dismissed by her without explanation. From the upstairs window of the plantation house, Eleanor could see nearly everything. The drive, the fields, the quarters, the path leading to the cellar entrance at the side of the house. She spent long hours there, unmoving, her fingers resting lightly on the glass. The slaves noticed. They always noticed. They also noticed that when Eleanor watched, someone was usually summoned, a knock at the quarters, a name spoken, a task assigned inside the house. It was never framed as punishment. It was never loud, just an instruction. The chosen slave would straighten their clothes, lower their eyes, and follow. Some returned, shaken and silent. Others did not return at all. Jonathan Whitmore told himself it was control, order, protection, his household, his rules. He had lost his wife years earlier, and Eleanor was all he had left of her, fragile, intense, prone to dark moods he didn't fully understand. When she began asking questions about obedience, about ownership, about what was permitted beneath his roof, he answered carefully at first, then less carefully, then not at all. The first time he locked the cellar door for her sake, his hands trembled. He remembered the sound, the iron sliding into place, the finality of it echoing through the floorboards. He told himself it was temporary, necessary, no different from any other authority he exercised daily. He prayed afterward. Long prayers, desperate prayers. Above him, Eleanor listened. From that moment on, the plantation changed in ways no ledger could record. Time felt distorted, days blurred together. The air inside the house carried a scent that candles couldn't mask, damp earth and something sharper beneath it. Eleanor's moods grew more precise, more demanding. She began requesting specific servants, specific hours. Jonathan obeyed, telling himself each time would be the last. Outside, life went on. Cotton was harvested, church bells rang, children were born in the quarters, but the cellar remained locked, and the ground beneath the house seemed to swallow sound more greedily with each passing week. One night, a storm rolled in without warning. Thunder shook the windows, and rain hammered the roof so hard it felt like the sky was trying to break in. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the side of the house and the cellar door. A slave working late saw it then, saw the scratches on the wood, fresh, deep, too deliberate to be from animals. He said nothing. Silence was survival. Inside, Eleanor stood at her window, watching the storm, her reflection flickering in the glass. Below her feet, something shifted. A sound rose, faint but unmistakably human, before the thunder swallowed it whole. She did not flinch. Lee smiled, slowly, as if reassured. Jonathan Whitmore sat alone in his study, head in his hands, the storm roaring around him. He knew in that moment that whatever had begun beneath his house could not remain hidden forever. Land remembers, walls remember, and cellars, no matter how deep, eventually demand to be opened. But in 1841, on that plantation in Georgia, the door stayed locked, and the night listened. By the time Eleanor Whitmore turned 19, loneliness had already reshaped her into something sharper and quieter than the girl she once was. She had grown up surrounded by people yet untouched by closeness, servants who bowed their heads, tutors who spoke only when spoken to, and a father who loved her deeply but from a careful distance, as if afraid that too much affection might crack something fragile inside her. Her mother's death had sealed that distance forever. After the funeral, the house became quieter, the halls longer, and Eleanor learned very early that silence could be controlled, shaped, and used. She was not born cruel. That was the lie Jonathan Whitmore told himself whenever doubt crept into his prayers. Eleanor, as a child, had been curious and intense, asking questions other children did not. Why did people obey? Why did some lives belong to others? Why did fear make grown men honest? At first, these questions were dismissed as imagination. Later, they were indulged. Jonathan believed that indulging her would keep her safe, from grief, from earnest, from becoming hardened like the world outside. Instead, it taught her that boundaries were optional. As she grew older, Eleanor began to notice the invisible rules that governed the plantation. A glance from her father could send a man running. A word from her lips could summon or dismiss a servant instantly. Power surrounded her like warm air, unnoticed but always present. It fascinated her. Not the loud kind of power men boasted about, but the quiet kind, the kind that bent behavior without raising its voice. She learned to watch, from the staircase, from the parlor, from the upstairs landing where shadows stretched long at sunset. She watched how people reacted when they thought no one important was looking, how their posture changed, how fear sharpened their attention, how obedience deepened when uncertainty entered the room. Eleanor stored these observations carefully, like pressed flowers hidden between book pages. Her father noticed the change but misunderstood it. He thought Eleanor was withdrawing, grieving in her own way. He allowed her more freedom than was customary, less supervision, more privacy. When she asked for rooms to herself, he granted them. When she dismissed maids, he respected her wishes. When she said certain servants made her uncomfortable, he had them reassigned without question. Then one evening, she asked something different. It was spoken softly, almost hesitantly, as if she were embarrassed by the thought. They were seated in the study, lamplight flickering across rows of ledgers and law books. Rain tapped gently against the windows. Eleanor's fingers traced the edge of the desk as she asked, "Father, do you ever think about what's allowed in this house simply because it's ours?" Jonathan looked up, confused. "Allowed how?" She shrugged, eyes lowered. "I mean, the rules. They apply everywhere else. But here you decide." He smiled faintly, seeing it as a philosophical question. "That's the nature of responsibility," he said. "A man must govern what is under his roof." Eleanor nodded slowly. She did not ask more that night. Days later, she asked for a servant to help her organize the upstairs rooms, someone strong enough to move furniture, quiet enough to not speak unnecessarily. Jonathan gave the order without hesitation. The task was ordinary. The servant was told to assist Eleanor and follow her instructions. When the servant returned hours later, his eyes were downcast, his hands trembling. He said nothing. Eleanor, when asked if everything was satisfactory, smiled and said yes. Jonathan felt a flicker of unease then, but he pushed it aside. The plantation required firmness. Eleanor required care. He told himself these things were not in conflict, but Eleanor was learning something new about herself. She learned that desire did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived as a thought that refused to leave, a curiosity that pressed closer each time it was ignored. She overed that control, pure, unquestioned control, could quiet the restless emptiness inside her better than conversation or music ever had. When someone stood before her waiting for instruction, when their breath changed depending on her tone, something inside her settled into place. She began requesting more help, more privacy, more specific instructions. Her father noticed the frequency but not the pattern. Each request, taken alone, was harmless. Together, they formed something he did not yet have a name for. The servants noticed first. They whispered at night, careful and afraid. They spoke of Eleanor's eyes, how they lingered too long, of the way she asked questions that had no right answers, of how some tasks took far longer than they should, of how some people came back different, silent, shaken, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. Still, no one spoke openly. Fear had its own gravity. Eleanor sensed the fear and welcomed it, not because she hated them, but because fear stripped away false politeness. It revealed truth. When someone feared her, they became more real to her, more present, more honest in their reactions. She told herself she was studying human nature, that she was simply curious. But curiosity began to crave repetition. One afternoon, she stood beside the cellar door while her father supervised repairs nearby. She ran her fingers along the wood, feeling the coolness beneath the paint. "It's quiet down there," she said casually. "Isn't it?" Jonathan nodded. "That's the point of a cellar." She tilted her head. "No windows, no distractions." He laughed, uneasy but indulgent. "You think too much, Eleanor." She smiled because she knew he was wrong. That evening she asked if the cellar could be used for storage again. Said she wanted space upstairs, wanted to reorganize. Jonathan agreed. When she asked for the key, he hesitated only a moment before handing it over. That night, Eleanor went down alone. The darkness welcomed her, the cool air, the way sound dissolved into nothing. She stood there, breathing slowly, imagining what it would be like to be unseen, unheard, completely at the mercy of whoever held the key. The thought sent a strange calm through her body. When she returned upstairs, she slept better than she had in years. After that, her requests grew more deliberate. A servant to help her late at night, another to fetch something from the cellar, another to wait while she decided what she needed. Jonathan noticed that some of these servants avoided her afterward, but he assumed it was shyness or guilt or simple exhaustion. The first disappearance happened quietly. A young man assigned to assist Eleanor one afternoon did not report back to the quarters that night. Jonathan was informed the next morning. He frowned, irritated. Runaways were inconvenient, dangerous, but not unheard of. He gave orders to make discreet inquiries. Eleanor said nothing when Jonathan suggested increasing oversight to prevent her incidents. Eleanor's voice sharpened for the first time. "You don't trust me?" she asked, eyes bright with something like hurt. He froze. That look, so much like her mother's when she felt betrayed, unraveled him instantly. He apologized, promised he hadn't meant it that way, promised her comfort and safety were his priority. Eleanor accepted his apology with quiet grace. From then on, Jonathan began locking doors he had never locked before, making excuses he had never needed, protecting not just his daughter but the image of her, the illusion that she was still the innocent girl the world believed her to be. Each compromise felt small, each decision felt justified, And Eleanor understood exactly what he was doing. She understood that love, when mixed with fear, could excuse almost anything. By the end of that year, the plantation was no longer just a place of labor and order. It had become a stage where Eleanor's unspoken hungers shaped reality itself. Her father, trapped by his own devotion, continued to play his role, convincing himself that he was in control. But control had already shifted. Beneath the house, beneath the silence, something was taking form. Fed by desire, protected by power, and sealed by a father's love that refused to see what it was becoming. And Eleanor Whitmore, standing at the center of it all, had learned the most dangerous lesson of her life. That when no one says no, desire does not stop. It only descends. The cellar was never meant to be a prison, but it became one the moment its purpose shifted from storage to secrecy. Beneath the wide plantation house, below polished floors and carefully chosen rugs, the space stretched deeper than most cellars of its kind. Its walls were rough clay reinforced with brick in uneven sections, darkened by years of dampness. The air was cool and heavy, carrying the scent of earth and iron. Sound behaved strangely there, footsteps softened, voices thinned, and cries, once released, seemed to sink downward rather than travel up. At first, the cellar was used in ways that felt almost reasonable. Boxes were moved, barrels stacked, old furniture placed along the walls. Eleanor insisted on order, on symmetry, on knowing exactly where everything belonged. She moved through the space with a lantern, its light carving narrow tunnels through the darkness. She paused often, listening, as if the cellar itself was speaking to her in a language only she understood. Jonathan Whitmore watched these preparations with an unease he refused to name. He supervised the installation of a stronger door and new iron fixtures, telling himself it was for security. The world beyond the plantation was unstable, he reasoned. Theft was common. Fear made people reckless. He spoke these thoughts aloud to anyone who asked, repeating them often enough that they began to sound true. When Eleanor requested that the cellar remain locked at all times, he agreed without argument. The first time a servant was brought down there intentionally, it happened under the guise of work. A simple instruction: carry these crates, organize these shelves, wait here while I decide what else needs doing. Eleanor's voice was calm, almost bored, as if the task were beneath her interest. She led the way with the lantern, never once looking back to see if she was being followed. Down the steps they went, each footfall echoing dully against the walls. The door closed behind them with a sound that felt final, even before the lock was turned. Eleanor did not rush. She moved slowly, deliberately, as though time itself had thickened in the cellar. She asked questions, quiet ones, observational ones. She watched reactions closely. Fear revealed itself in small ways, a breath held too long, a tremor in the hands, eyes that darted toward the stairs again and again. She found these signs fascinating, almost reassuring. When she finally left the cellar that first time, she did so alone. Jonathan told himself it was discipline, that the servant had disobeyed or spoken out of turn or deserved correction. He did not ask for details. He locked the door himself, the iron biting into place with a dull scrape that echoed through the house. He stood there afterward longer than necessary, hand still on the key, listening to nothing at all. From that moment the cellar ceased to be a place people went. It became a place people vanished into. Eleanor refined her rules quickly. No shouting, no banging on the door. Silence was rewarded. Resistance was not. She learned that fear could be shaped just as carefully as obedience, that people could be trained to respond to tone alone. She rarely raised her voice. She did not need to. The power she held was absolute within those walls, and she knew it. Above ground, Jonathan's life narrowed. He stopped inviting guests. He limited visits from neighbors. Church attendance became sporadic. When questioned, he cited Eleanor's delicate health, her need for rest. He was protecting her, he insisted, protecting the family, protecting himself from a truth he felt pressing against him every time he passed over the cellar. The house changed its habits. Floors were covered more thickly with rugs. Music was played more often in the evenings. Doors were closed that once stood open. The staff moved quietly, communicating with glances rather than words. They learned to listen for Eleanor's footsteps, to avoid certain corridors at certain hours. Those who were taken to the cellar came back altered, if they came back at all. Some returned hollow-eyed, obedient to a fault, speaking only when spoken to. Others refused food, refused sleep, as if the darkness had followed them upstairs. A few disappeared entirely, their names erased from daily routines as if they had never existed. Jonathan kept records. He always had. Names, assignments, dates. At first he wrote explanations in the margins, reassigned, sold, punished. Over time, the margins filled with blank spaces instead. He stopped writing altogether. Eleanor, meanwhile, grew calmer, more focused. The restlessness that once haunted her eyes faded into something colder, steadier. She slept soundly, she ate well, she spent hours reading in the parlor, her demeanor so composed that it disarmed suspicion. If anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed how her fingers sometimes paused mid-turn of a page, as if listening for a sound only she could hear. Below her, the cellar learned its role. The darkness became complete once the lantern was extinguished. Time lost meaning there. Without windows, without sound, the mind turned inward, folding in on itself. Eleanor understood this instinctively. She used silence as carefully as she used words. Sometimes she would leave someone alone for hours, days even, returning unexpectedly, watching the shock ripple through them as the light reappeared. She never stayed long. Control, she had learned, did not require presence. It required uncertainty. Jonathan's guilt took shape in physical ways. His hands shook when he poured his evening drink. His sleep grew shallow, filled with dreams of doors he could not open. Once, late at night, he descended the cellar steps alone, lantern in hand, heart pounding so loudly he was certain it could be heard. He stopped halfway down. From the darkness below came a sound, faint, broken, unmistakably human. It did not rise in a scream. It lingered, trembling, as if afraid of being punished for excess. Jonathan froze, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, and he did. The next morning he ordered thicker padding placed along the cellar door. For privacy, he said, for insulation, for silence. Eleanor noticed his growing fear and found it comforting. It meant he would not interfere. It meant the cellar remained hers. She began to think of it not as a space beneath the house, but as a separate world entirely, one where her desires defined reality and consequences did not follow. The slaves sensed the shift. Whispers traveled carefully through the quarters. Stories half told, warnings disguised as advice. Avoid the big house at night. Keep your head down. Never volunteer. Never be alone when Eleanor is watching. Fear became routine. Then came the night everything nearly broke. A young woman, newly assigned to the house, was taken to the cellar just after dusk. She had been told it was for cleaning. She went willingly, unaware. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. The house slept, but the cellar did not. Some time before dawn, a sound escaped. It was brief, sharp, wrong. It slipped through a gap in the door, traveled up the stairs, and reached the hallway above before dying out. A servant carrying water froze, bucket slipping from their hands. Another heard it from the kitchen and crossed themselves instinctively. By morning, the plantation buzzed with unspoken tension. Jonathan felt it the moment he stepped outside. The air was tight, expectant. He moaned Eleanor and asked, too sharply, what had happened the night before. For the first time, she did not answer immediately. She studied him, her gaze cool and assessing, as if measuring how far she could go. She was disobedient, Eleanor said finally. You taught me that order matters. The words struck him harder than any accusation could have. He had taught her that. He had shaped this logic. His authority, his silence, his love had all fed the thing growing beneath his house. He said nothing. That silence was the moment the cellar became permanent. After that, iron bars were installed on the inside of the door, not to keep people out, but to keep them in. Jonathan signed off on the expense himself, barely glancing at the invoice. He stopped asking questions entirely. Eleanor descended more often now, her visits purposeful, efficient. She no longer lingered, she no longer explored. The cellar was no longer a curiosity, it was a mechanism, a place where her will was enacted without resistance, and the land around the house seemed to feel it. Grass above the cellar thinned. Animals avoided that side of the property. Even the soil seemed darker there, damp longer after rain. The house creaked at night, settling in ways it never had before, as if adjusting to a weight it had not been built to carry. Some secrets poison only the people who keep them. Others seep into everything. By the end of that summer, the cellar beneath Jonathan Whitmore's plantation was no lounge, just hidden. It was entrenched, layered with fear, silence, and a truth so heavy that even the walls seemed to bend around it. Eleanor held the key, Jonathan held his guilt, and everyone else held their breath, because cellars, like consciences, can be buried deep, but they are never empty. Silence had always ruled plantations, but on Whitmore land it began to rot. It crept into every corner, thick and sour, changing the way people breathed and moved. Slaves who once spoke softly now spoke hardly at all. Even the birds seemed to avoid the big house, their calls thinning near the cellar side of the property. Fear had settled into routine, and routine made it dangerous, because routine made people notice patterns. Patterns were impossible to hide forever. It began with small things. A missing name spoken twice before someone remembered not to say it again. A pair of shoes left outside the quarters, never reclaimed. Extra food prepared that went untouched. The overseer complained quietly to Jonathan Whitmore that labor assignments no longer balanced, that people were vanishing faster than could be explained by sales or sickness. Jonathan listened without meeting his eyes and dismissed him with vague assurances. Inside, Jonathan felt the weight of it pressing against his chest. He had begun waking before dawn, heart racing, convinced he had heard the cellar door open. Some mornings he found the key already missing from its hook. Other mornings it was there, neatly returned, as if to remind him who truly controlled that space. Eleanor noticed his unraveling and adjusted accordingly. She grew gentler in public, softer in tone, almost dutiful. She took meals with him again, asked after his health, played the piano in the evenings, the music floating through the house like a careful apology. To anyone watching, it looked like a daughter tending to her aging father. But below the surface, her grip tightened. She began enforcing stricter rules in the cellar. Time limits, silence enforced with precision. She learned exactly how long fear took to soften into submission, how uncertainty could break a will more effectively than force ever could. She understood now that terror, when applied carefully, did not explode, it seeped. The slaves felt the shift immediately. Those who had returned from the cellar before, quiet, broken, obedient, became living warnings. They flinched at the sound of keys. They avoided the house even when summoned, delaying as long as they dared. Others watched them closely, reading the truth in their hollow eyes. Whispers grew bolder, though never loud. Conversations happened while working, backs turned, mouths barely moving. It's the cellar. Don't go alone. If she watches you too long, stay with others. Fear sharpened into awareness, and awareness once shared becomes dangerous. One night, a man named Thomas, older, steady, known for keeping his head down, was summoned to the house. He had worked the plantation for years, survived cruelty by becoming invisible. That night, he did something unexpected. He did not go alone. He waited until another worker passed nearby and murmured, barely audible, "If I don't come back by morning, remember my name." It was not a plea, it was a statement. Thomas entered the house. The door closed behind him. Morning came. Thomas did not return. His name did not disappear. It was spoken quietly, passed carefully, carried like a fragile thing from person to person. Someone carved it into the underside of a bench in the quarters. Someone else whispered it to a new arrival, a warning disguised as introduction. Thomas became proof, not just of disappearance but of intention. Jonathan sensed the change before he understood it. He felt eyes on the house in a way he never had before, not hostile, but alert, waiting. He increased patrols, ordered stricter oversight. The overseer suggested punishment to reassert control. Jonathan refused, not out of mercy, but out of fear. Punishment drew attention. Attention invited questions, and questions, once asked by the wrong people, could tear everything apart. Jonathan was no longer managing a plantation, he was managing a secret, and secrets require isolation to survive. Eleanor disagreed. She believed fear needed reinforcement. One evening, she took someone new to the cellar, a young woman who resisted in a way Eleanor hadn't seen before, not loudly, not violently, but with refusal. Silence hardened into defiance. Woman would not follow instructions, would not lower her eyes, would not surrender control. Eleanor felt something snap. The encounter ended badly, too badly. A sound escaped the cellar that night that could not be mistaken for imagination. It was short, sharp, and final. It rose through the house like a blade before being swallowed by walls and rugs and locked doors. But it had traveled far enough, too far. The kitchen staff heard it. A stable hand near the house heard it. A child in the quarters woke screaming without knowing why. For the first time, fear moved faster than silence. By morning, the plantation felt wrong. Jonathan confronted Eleanor before breakfast. His voice shook despite his effort to steady it. He demanded to know what she had done. She did not deny it. She did not apologize. She only looked at him with something close to disappointment. "You promised," she said quietly. "You promised you would protect me." The words cut deep because they were true. He had promised, over and over again. Protection had become his excuse, his shield against the truth. And now she was using it against him with perfect clarity. Jonathan realized then that he had lost whatever authority he believed he still held. The cellar was no longer something he allowed, it was something he was trapped by. Outside, tension thickened. A slave was caught trying to leave the property without permission. Instead of fleeing, instead of denying, he did something reckless. He spoke, not loudly, not publicly, but to the wrong ears. A traveling merchant had stopped at the plantation for supplies. The man mentioned missing workers, mentioned the cellar, mentioned screams swallowed by the house. The merchant listened without comment, but merchants traveled. Words moved with them. Rumors do not need detail to grow, they only need direction. Within weeks, whispers reached neighboring plantations. Nothing concrete, just unease, just questions. "Have you heard? Something's wrong up there." Whitmore keeps his cellar locked day and night. In another time, it would have meant nothing. But times were changing, slowly, unevenly. Attention from outside had become dangerous. Jonathan felt it closing in. He began drinking earlier, sleeping less. He checked the cellar lock obsessively, sometimes finding the iron warm to the touch when it should have been cold. He imagined the house watching him, judging him. He avoided mere... Eleanor, sensing the pressure from beyond the plantation, adjusted again. She reduced her visits, became more selective. She believed restraint would preserve what she had built. She did not understand that restraint. Too late, only sharpened suspicion. Then came the mistake that could not be undone. A young man was taken to the cellar just before sunset. He had been warned, he had heard the whispers, and he decided he would not disappear quietly. When Eleanor left him alone, he acted. He used the darkness, the walls, the loosened brick Jonathan had ignored during renovations. He injured himself in the attempt, but pain no longer mattered. When Eleanor returned, lantern raised, she found blood where obedience should have been. The confrontation was brief, violent, chaotic. But the damage was done. The young man did not escape the cellar. Something else did. A bloodied handprint appeared on the inside of the door. Not wiped away in time, not hidden. When Jonathan found it hours later, he stared at it for a long moment before sinking to the floor. That mark haunted him. He tried to clean it himself, scrubbed until his hands burned, but the stain lingered, faint but visible in certain light. It became a symbol of everything he could no longer deny. Outside the plantation, pressure grew sharper. A local official arrived under the pretense of checking records. He asked too many questions. His eyes lingered on the house too long. He noticed the reinforced cellar door. Jonathan answered carefully, smiling, sweating through his collar. Eleanor watched from the staircase, expression unreadable. That night, Jonathan finally spoke the words he had avoided for years. "This has to stop." Eleanor did not respond immediately. She studied him, the way she studied everyone, before deciding how to proceed. "You don't mean that," she said calmly. "I do," he insisted, though his voice cracked. "This will destroy us." She stepped closer, her voice lowering. "It already has," she said. "You just can't bear to see it." The truth of that settled between them like a verdict. Jonathan realized then that silence had not protected his daughter. It had shaped her. And now it threatened to expose them both. The plantation stood on the edge of discovery, its carefully buried truth pushing upward through cracks too wide to ignore. Whispers had become patterns, patterns had become suspicion. And suspicion, once it reaches the right ears, becomes something far more dangerous than rebellion, justice, or fire. As the summer waned, the Whitmore plantation felt like a held breath, too long, too tight. Everyone sensed that something was coming. No one knew what shape it would take, only that the cellar, no matter how deep, could no longer hold what had been buried there. And beneath the house, in the dark that had consumed so many secrets, the silence began to tremble. The end did not arrive with sirens or sermons. It came quietly, the way truth often does, slipping through the smallest crack and widening it until the structure that depended on silence could no longer stand. It began with heat. That summer lingered longer than it should have, pressing down on the land like a punishment. The air grew thick enough to taste, and the house groaned beneath it, wood expanding, nails whining softly in the night. Even the cellar seemed to breathe differently, exhaling dampness that crept up through the floors. Jonathan Whitmore felt it everywhere, on his skin, in his chest, in the way his thoughts no longer lined up cleanly. He knew something was coming. He had known it for weeks. He simply did not know from which direction it would arrive. Eleanor sensed it too, though she interpreted the feeling differently. To her, the tension felt like anticipation, a tightening before release. She moved through the house with a careful, calm, conserving energy, watching and waiting. She believed she had learned restraint. She believed she could control the pace of what came next. She was wrong. The first flame was metaphorical. A letter arrived from the county office requesting a formal review of plantation records, sales, transfers, deaths. It was written politely, professionally, but the subtext was unmistakable. Someone had asked questions. Someone had listened. Jonathan read the letter twice, then folded it with trembling hands. He did not show it to Eleanor immediately. For the first time in years, he tried to imagine a future that did not include protecting her at all costs. That night, he went to the cellar alone. He had not done that since the beginning, not truly. He carried the lantern carefully, descending each step as if the stairs might collapse beneath him. The air grew colder with every foot, heavier with every breath. When he reached the bottom, he stopped. The space looked smaller than he remembered, not physically but morally, as if the cellar itself had shrunk under the weight of what it held. The walls bore marks he could no longer pretend were from age alone. Scratches, smears, indentations where hands had pressed too hard against brick. Jonathan raised the lantern higher. For the first time he did not turn away. What he saw did not scream at him, it did not accuse him, it simply existed, undeniable and final. The truth, once fully seen, did not need volume. It crushed him in silence. Above him, Eleanor felt the shift. She heard the cellar door open, heard her father's footsteps descend. She stood in the hallway perfectly still, listening. When the door closed again, slower this time, something inside her tightened, not with fear but with irritation. He had crossed a line. The cellar was hers. Even now, even after everything, she believed that. When Jonathan emerged, his face looked older than it had ever looked before. He did not speak to her. He did not scold or plead. He walked past her and into his study, locking the door behind him. That, more than anything, unsettled Eleanor. Isolation had always been her weapon. Now it was being used against her. Outside, the plantation stirred. The rumors that had once moved like shadows now walked openly. A neighboring landowner stopped by under the pretense of borrowing equipment and lingered too long near the cellar side of the house. A preacher asked pointed questions during Sunday service. The overseer resigned without explanation, refusing to stay another day. People were no longer afraid to notice, and noticing changed everything. The real flame came 3 nights later. No one ever knew exactly how it started. Some said it was a lantern knocked over in the storage shed. Others said it was a spark from the kitchen chimney carried by a dry wind, but those who were there remembered how quickly it spread, and where it moved first, toward the house. Shouts broke the night. Slaves poured from the quarters, pointing, yelling. Smoke curled along the ground, thick and oily. Jonathan stumbled outside, coughing, eyes wide with disbelief. He shouted orders no one followed. The fire did not care about hierarchy or authority. It moved with hunger, climbing the side of the house, licking at shutters and eaves. Eleanor stood at the top of the stairs, watching. For the first time she looked uncertain. Jonathan rushed inside, ignoring the heat, the falling embers. He shouted her name, demanding she leave, grabbing her arm with a strength she had never felt from him before. She pulled away instinctively, eyes darting, not to him but to the hallway leading to the cellar. "The key," she said sharply. "We need the key." Jonathan froze. Smoke filled his lungs. The truth filled his chest. In that moment, something inside him broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and understood that saving her now meant damning himself forever. "I can't," he said. The words shocked them both. The fire roared closer. Beams cracked overhead. Somewhere below, iron heated, expanding with sharp metallic cries. The cellar door groaned. Jonathan dragged Eleanor toward the exit as the ceiling above the stairs collapsed behind them. She fought him, screaming now, not in fear but in rage. Outside, chaos reigned. People shouted warnings. Buckets were passed, but the fire had already chosen its victim. The house burned, and with it, the cellar, iron warped. Wood split. The locked door, heated beyond endurance, finally gave way, not opened by a key but forced by flame. What had been sealed by silence was exposed by destruction. By morning the fire was out. Smoke drifted low over the ruins. The house stood blackened and hollow, its grandeur reduced to ash and skeletal beams. People gathered at a distance, drawn by equal parts curiosity and dread. And then they saw it. The cellar entrance, torn open. What was revealed did not come out all at once. It emerged in fragments, objects, evidence, proof too heavy to be dismissed. The whispers that followed were no longer rumors. They were confirmations. Jonathan Whitmore was found sitting on the ground, staring at the ruins, his hands burned, his expression empty. He did not resist when officials approached. He did not deny anything. When asked why he had allowed it to happen, he answered honestly for the first time in years, "I thought I was protecting her." Eleanor was nowhere to be found. Some said she fled into the fields during the fire. Others claimed she disappeared into the woods beyond the property. A few believed she never left the house at all. No body was ever identified with certainty. Her absence became another kind of silence, one that unsettled people far more than her presence ever had. Investigations followed. Records were seized. Testimonies gathered. The plantation was shut down, its land divided, its name spoken only with discomfort. Jonathan Whitmore did not live to see the end of it. He faded quickly as if his body had been held together by denial alone. Years later, the land was sold. New owners built nothing where the house had stood. The ground refused it. Crops grew poorly there. Animals avoided it. Even children sensed something wrong and stayed away. People still told stories. They spoke of a cellar that was never meant to hold desire, of a father who mistook love for protection, of a daughter who learned that power, once unchecked, consumes everything around it, including itself. And they remembered this most of all, that evil does not always arrive shouting. Sometimes it arrives softly, wrapped in affection, protected by silence. But no matter how deep you bury it, no matter how carefully you lock it away, the truth always finds a way out.